I just found a gap in history and I'm trying to understand where were the Asian and Hispanic kids during the segregation era? Like when it was whites only and coloreds only and the black people were integrating into white schools. Where were the other races of people at?
We know that America is a multiracial country where different races and different ethnicities have coexisted together for years. When you look at the history of America, we know the kind of persecutions and challenges that black people have gone through under the hands of the whites. But then one question that keeps coming around every time we look at how American society is formed is why only black people have been targeted over the years. I know many may wonder why I'm asking this question. But if you look at the history books or what has been publicly proclaimed all over these years, we are finding out that only blacks and whites have been mentioned as people who have been antagonizing each other. However, the main question you should ask, where were the ASIANS and where were the Latinos? This same question was asked by this lady in this video that I'm going to play for you. So I want us to watch this, then come back and share our thoughts together.
I just found a gap in history and I'm trying to understand where were the Asian and Hispanic kids during the segregation era? Like when it was whites only and coloreds only and the black people were integrating into white schools. Where were the other races of people at? Because when you look at the history books, you only see black and white kids. Like you see an all black school and an all white school, and that's how they talk about it in the history books. Like this school's all white and this school's all black, and and I know they said colored, so you'd be like, oh, like everybody, but you never saw Asian kids at black schools. They weren't in the pictures. Or Spanish kids at black schools. So where did they go to school? And did they not care about integration? Like when did they come into the equation and start integrating too? Why is that such a gap? Am I tripping? Maybe I'm skipping a part of it. I feel like learning history like my whole life, they've never talked about. They never talked about the integration of Asian Americans into white schools or Spanish or Hispanic people into white schools. Like they never talked about that. So I don't know. It's just a thought. I just crossed my mind right now, so I just thought I'd say it out loud. I just found a gap in history and I'm trying to understand where were the Asian and Hispanic kids during the segregation era? Like when it was whites only and coloreds only.
Hi, political science major here. They were here. There is no gap. What you might be experiencing or might think is a gap is probably the lack of the vocalization of the stories or the stories not being told all throughout textbooks. But for someone like me who went to college for this, it's right there. It's in the history books, and it was in some of my high school history books as well, to be fair to our government. Okay, I'm going to try to use three things to try to layer out why I think you may feel like there was a gap or why it seems like that story is not being told or vocalized. The three things are population, location, and assimilation. I'm going to try as best as I can to use facts and not try to opine too much. All right. So the first one is population. So during the height of which, considered civil rights era, supported by my background here, 85% of the population was white. 11% was black, less than 4% was Latino, less than 6% was for foreign born, and I'm presuming that remaining kind of like 0.00 some percent, like in 1960, for example, I think 980,000 people identified as Asian. So that's a very small number. And I think we can conclude that with population, the larger population will have a bigger impact as far as their story being told, as far as their fight for freedom, right? So 11% of black people going through, not all 11, but you get my point, going through Jim Crow segregation and marching. That is obviously going to make the worldwide news. There's going to be more stories written about those marches in the history book. Okay. Now, if you compare that Latino population to now, this is probably why you're seeing this discrepancy. It doesn't make sense to you. The Latino population, I believe, is going to be more than almost 22% of the U.S. population. That is a huge jump. Okay. But during the 1960s, these fights were there, right? Or even before the 1960s, right? There are a number of, Latino fight for segregation, for desegregation, right? So you see Mexican Americans going through segregation in California schools, right? There were riots. There were things like the Zoot Suit riots in the 1940s, which was also in Los Angeles, California, which leads me to my next point, which is location. So here's the thing. America's makeup, how it is now and how we know it now is a lot different from what it was back in the 1950s and 1960s in terms of location and demographics. Okay, so in America, a large part of what most people focused on and cared about, especially is the northern part of America and the South. But a lot of places where the Latino population, remember, we've established that they were small, they were located in the western, southwest part of America. Okay, and the fundamental difference between the southwest part of America's segregation versus the southern segregation, where a lot of black African American people were, is they didn't have these laws coded. They didn't have these segregation laws coded. They didn't have these English only laws coded, unlike the Deep South, in which they had these segregation laws, Jim Crow laws, most of the time, not all the time, coded. Okay, so that's kind of the first problem. The second thing is, again, how much attention was paid to the western portion of America. Like, California now to have, a large number of electoral votes, right? It to be immensely populated. It to be a integral part to America now. The New Mexicos and whatever of the world. It didn't used to always be like that. So it was easier for what was going on in the western part of America to, either not be documented, to either not be looked at with, analyzed with deep lenses. But as you can see here, for context, there are documented, lawsuits of Mexican American parents suing Orange County, California school districts on behalf of their children and 5,000 other children of Mexican and Latin descent, arguing that the segregation, even though it was not coded in the law, was violating their constitutional rights. So these things existed. It was there. It happened. Okay. So, like, for context, if you go to learningforjustice.org, you'll see some of just documented history of the fight by Mexican, Hispanic population from the 60s on, things like the Latino high school walkouts, and you'll see it. It's there. You can even go back as early as the 1910s and see, what the Hispanic population was doing. And then there are also stuff about the Asian population, but again, it was different. When we talk about the Chinese with the gold rush, that's a little more complex, and I just want to keep this as simple as possible, right? It's there. Like, it's right there. There was a Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund that pursued protection of civil rights of Mexican Americans. Like, it's there. Okay, that's just my main point. Now, my final point is more of kind of an opinion or conclusion / inference that I've drawn, and which is the concept of assimilation. I think that unlike Black Americans, I think that there is an easier path to assimilation for Hispanic Americans, and sometimes Asian Americans in the United States, but particularly with Hispanic Americans, to be able to assimilate into whiteness, right? And I think that because of that, year over year assimilation, even though some people may still identify as Hispanic, I think that there is less incentive to, regurgitate and or keep putting the story of Americans' treatment of their forefathers to the forefront. This part is mostly opinion. And I think that unlike, a lot of African American brothers and sisters who have, grandparents and great grandparents telling them the stories of what they went through in the Deep South, and they are still seeing kind of, I guess, the consequences of that, and they're still seeing some of that similar treatment in America today. It's harder for Black people to assimilate with whiteness, unless, again, you're biracial and then you marry a white person, and that type of conversation, which is for another day. It's, I think, much easier for an Hispanic American who is not Afro, Latino, to assimilate. And the easier you can assimilate, the easier you are to probably forgive your government, to not, to let bygones be bygones. So I hope I explained this well. I do vividly remembering my high school history books having some of these stories. I don't think it was as detailed as stuff that I learned in college, but if you most definitely just type in Latino segregation era, a lot of this stuff will pop up. All right.
Wow, I think you've heard the explanation that young guy has given to the lady. And from my side, I also tend to side with him to some extent. However, you'll find that the agenda of Jim Crow was to implement segregation and really fight the Black people who thought that they were going to be handed over their rights after the Civil War. in the Reconstruction period, but there are certain things that are worth noting. The white guys at that time, their main agenda was to ensure that they are going to deal with people piece by piece. They did not want to have a big group of people that they're dealing with, and therefore they would find ways of dividing everybody in as much as they are able to achieve their agenda. So in this case, whites managed to really put blacks in a corner and deal them their cuts that they wanted to do. But here is what happened. Jim Crow laws enacted primarily in the Southern Union states from the late 19th century until the mid 20th century were a series of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation and discrimination, predominantly against African Americans. Here is why these laws did not explicitly target Latinos and Asians. Historical context and focus on African Americans. Jim Crow laws emerged in the aftermath of Reconstruction following the Civil War, a period where the focus was on controlling and segregating the newly emancipated black population. The primary aim was to maintain white supremacy by forcing racial segregation and disenfranchising African Americans. The sociopolitical landscape of the time was thus heavily centered around the black versus white dichotomy. Just after the Civil War, the Reconstruction period was when America was to really become a United States of America, where the southern and the northern states were to come together. But then the white people had an agenda, and that is why they found a strategy to keep blacks segregated away from other races. And their main agenda was to target purely black people, as it has been demonstrated. The other one is demographic considerations. At the time Jim Crow laws were being enacted, the Latinos and Asian population in the southern states, where these laws were most prevalent, were relatively small compared to African American population. Latinos, particularly those from Mexico, were more concentrated in the southwest, while Asian populations, mainly Chinese at the time, were in the place like California. Therefore, these groups did not represent a significant demographic threat to the established racial hierarchy in the South. So having seen that the black population was rising so fast, the white people decided to find a way through which they could suppress them and they could manage them, because they thought that at one point blacks could overpower us, and that is why they implemented such kind of things, which I'm happy they did not succeed with them. Legal and social structures. The legal framework of Jim Crow was built around the one-drop rule, which classified anyone with a sub-Saharan African ancestry as black or Negro. This was less applicable to Latinos and Asians who, despite facing discrimination, were not usually categorized under the same racial laws due to different perceived racial identities. Instead, they faced discrimination through other means like immigration laws, land ownership restrictions, and labor exploitations. We also have different forms of discrimination. While Jim Crow laws did not explicitly target Latinos and Asians, these groups were not immune to racial discrimination. For instance, Asians faced the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred Chinese immigration, and Latinos encountered policies like Operation Wetback in the 1950s. Discrimination against these groups was enacted through different mechanisms, often at the federal level or through local practices, rather than through state-sanctioned segregation laws like those under the Jim Crow. Economic and political power. The political and economic structures in the South had less incentive to target Latinos and Asians with specific segregation laws, since they were not seen as an immediate threat to the existing power structures in the same way African Americans were post-slavery. As such, Jim Crow laws were tailored to uphold racial segregation against African Americans due to historical, demographic, and socio-political reasons. While Latinos and Asians faced significant racial discrimination in the United States, the mechanisms and legal frameworks used against them differed from those used under Jim Crow, reflecting different racial dynamics and power structures at play. So this generally explains how everything happened. And I think this explanation adds to what the other guy has given. One thing that I am really quite impressed about is the fact that we are able to note that Black Americans at the time of implementation of the Jim Crow laws were so huge. In fact, I think they were the second largest population. In fact, I think they were the second largest demographic in America after white people. And what happens is that since whites saw them as a threat, they wanted to limit their growth in all spheres, be it economics, be it in politics, be it in their societal existence. So that is why you find that these laws targeted specifically Black people. And the lady is right in asking, where were the Asians and Latinos? And this explanation, I think, gives us the best answer to where they were and why they were not explicitly targeted by the Jim Crow laws and rules. Tell me down in the comment section what you think about this. And if you're watching us for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and also share. Thank you, and may the good Lord bless you. Goodbye.